One afternoon, while on patrol through a rugged stretch of scrubland, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne noticed movement ahead. Low, silent, deliberate. A full-grown bobcat emerged from the brush, powerful and alert, its eyes fixed on him. Instinct told him to stay still, to respect the animal's space, but something about its posture felt different. The bobcat didn't flee. Instead, it circled slowly, watching him with an intensity that felt almost familiar. Marcus held his composure, though his heart pounded, unsure whether he was witnessing curiosity or being tested. Then it locked eyes with him and began to close the distance. 30 meters, 20, 15. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. This wasn't normal. The animal stepped closer, just enough for him to catch sight of a faint, jagged scar along its shoulder. The exact spot where, a year earlier, he had treated a deep wound on a struggling juvenile bobcat. Could this really be the same kitten he had fought so hard to save? What happened next revealed a truth no soldier and no wildlife rehabilitator could ever be prepared for. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning broke over the vast, rugged expanse of the Texas scrubland with an unrelenting, crystalline brightness. There was no haze, no softening of the horizon, only a sharp, clear light that etched every mesquite bush, every jagged rock, and every dried blade of grass in stark relief against a pale blue sky. It was a landscape that demanded respect, a dry ocean of earth and thorn where only the resilient survived. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne marched with the rhythmic, ground-eating stride of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades carrying heavy loads across hostile terrains. His squad was spread out behind him in a loose wedge formation, conducting a long-range reconnaissance patrol. The heat of the American Southwest was already beginning to rise, baking the scent of dust and crushed creosote into the air. Marcus wiped a line of sweat from his brow, adjusting the weight of his tactical gear. The blinding clarity of the morning light offered perfect visibility, a tactical advantage, yet it also stripped the land of its mysteries. Every shadow was a hard, black pool beneath the boulders. Every movement was instantly betrayed. It was an environment of absolute truths, where weakness was quickly exposed and remedied by the harsh laws of nature. Despite the focus required for the patrol, Marcus's mind occasionally drifted. It was a coping mechanism developed over years of deployments. When the physical toll of the march grew heavy, he allowed his thoughts to anchor themselves to a different time, a different kind of service. Before this current deployment, during a prolonged leave of absence while recovering from a minor shrapnel injury, he had spent his days entirely differently. He had traded the olive drab and camouflage for the stained canvas work clothes of a volunteer wildlife rehabilitator at a sanctuary nestled in the quiet, rolling hills of the hill country. He was a soldier by trade, but a conservationist by heart. He understood the fragile balance of ecosystems, the quiet, desperate struggles that occurred far away from human eyes. And as he walked through the sun-bleached scrubland, the crunch of his boots on the gravel sounding like a metronome, the memory of one particular struggle surfaced, vivid and unbidden. It was a memory that always brought a tight ache to his chest, a memory of a creature broken by the world and the agonizing process of putting it back together. The memory began in darkness and desperation, a stark contrast to the brilliant morning light of his current patrol. It was over a year ago. A local rancher had brought in a cardboard box, his weathered face tight with grim resignation. Inside the box lay a juvenile bobcat, perhaps 5 months old, and it was dying. Marcus remembered the smell first, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the unmistakable odor of necrotic tissue and sheer primal terror. When he had carefully opened the flaps of the box, wearing heavy leather handling gloves, his heart had dropped into his stomach. The kitten was a tragedy of fur and bone. It was severely emaciated, its ribs protruding sharply against its flanks, its beautiful spotted coat dull and matted with dirt and dried blood. But it was the shoulder that was the true horror. The young bobcat had likely been caught in a snare or a deeply rusted section of barbed wire fencing, panicked, and torn itself free at a terrible cost. A massive, jagged laceration ripped across its left shoulder blade, deep enough to expose the muscle fascia, infected and weeping. It was a heart-wrenching sight. The kitten was too weak to hiss, too exhausted to fight. It simply lay there, its large, tufted ears flattened against its skull, its golden eyes wide and dilated with the dull glaze of impending shock. It was a wild, magnificent predator reduced to a fragile, broken ghost, trembling with every shallow breath it took. "Is he going to make it?" the rancher had asked, twisting his hat in his hands. "I don't know," Marcus had replied, his voice gruff to hide the emotion swelling in his throat. "But we're going to give him a fighting chance." What followed were the most grueling weeks of Marcus's life, rivaling any military training he had endured. Wildlife rehabilitation is not a Disney movie. It is an exhausting, emotionally draining science. The first 48 hours were a battle against dehydration and sepsis. Marcus worked alongside the lead veterinarian, administering subcutaneous fluids, lactated Ringer's solution, to rehydrate the fragile animal. They cleaned the massive wound with chlorhexidine, carefully debriding the dead tissue, a process the kitten endured with a stoic, silent trembling that broke Marcus's heart anew each time. Because the bobcat was a juvenile, it required a highly specialized diet. It was past the stage of needing strictly kitten milk replacer, KMR, but its digestive system was too compromised for heavy, whole prey. Marcus spent hours meticulously preparing a slurry of specialized carnivorous recovery diet, warming it to the exact temperature of freshly killed prey, and feeding it to the bobcat via a long syringe to maintain distance. This was the hardest part of the rehabilitation, the golden rule that broke every human instinct. If they love you, you have failed. To save a wild bobcat, you had to ensure it retained its deep, instinctual fear of humans. Imprinting or habituating a predator was a death sentence. A fearless bobcat would wander into human settlements, raid chicken coops, or approach hikers, leading inevitably to its destruction. And so, Marcus had to be the warden, not the mother. He wore a camouflage face mask and a poncho draped over his clothes whenever he entered the enclosure to prevent the cat from recognizing a human form or associating his scent with food. He moved silently, never speaking to the animal, never offering a comforting touch. It went against everything in his soul. When the kitten, in its pain and confusion, would occasionally look up with those wide, golden eyes, seeking a connection, seeking a source of comfort, Marcus had to harden his heart, step back, and close the door. As the weeks turned into months, the heart-wrenching reality of the kitten's condition slowly gave way to the cautious optimism of recovery. The antibiotics took hold. The dead tissue sloughed away, and healthy pink granulation tissue began to fill the terrible void on the bobcat's shoulder. Marcus watched, hidden behind the one-way glass of the rehabilitation enclosure, as the ghost became a predator again. The specialized diet gave way to whole prey, thawed mice and quail, essential for providing the calcium and taurine a growing feline required. The bobcat's coat regained its luster, the rosettes and spots blooming into a beautiful, earthy camouflage. The wound eventually healed, but it left a permanent mark, a distinct, pale, jagged scar that ran from the top of the shoulder blade down toward the elbow, a silent testament to its will to survive. With physical recovery came the return of the wild spirit. The trembling weakness was replaced by coiled tension. Where the kitten had once lain passively during enclosure cleanings, the juvenile bobcat now retreated to the highest shelf, hissing defensively, a low guttural warning that vibrated through the air. Marcus rejoiced at that sound. That hiss was the sound of success. It meant the wildness had not been extinguished. The day of the release was a day Marcus carried with him like a heavy, precious stone. It was a crisp, clear morning, much like the one he was walking through now. They had driven the transport crate deep into a protected state park, miles away from any roads, farms, or human infrastructure. When Marcus opened the door of the crate, he didn't know what to expect. Some animals lingered, confused by the sudden expanse of freedom. But not this one. The bobcat had exploded from the crate, a blur of spotted fur and muscular grace. It hit the ground running, its powerful hind legs propelling it toward the dense cover of the brush. It didn't pause. It didn't look back. It simply vanished into the landscape it belonged to. Marcus had stood there for a long time, the empty crate hanging heavy in his hand. He felt a profound sense of emptiness, a void where his constant worry and care had been. But beneath that emptiness was a soaring, triumphant joy. He had not gained a pet. He had returned a vital piece of the wilderness to its rightful place. He had saved a life by ensuring that life would never need him again. "Sergeant Thorne, hold up." The voice of Corporal Hayes, his point man, broke through Marcus's reverie, pulling him violently from the memory of the sanctuary and back to the glaring reality of the Texas scrubland. Marcus raised a closed fist, the universal signal to halt. The squad froze instantly, sinking slightly at the knees, weapons at the low ready, scanning their designated sectors. The silence of the desert rushed back in, broken only by the sound of the wind pushing through the dry thorn bushes. "What do you see, Hayes?" Marcus whispered into his comms, stepping forward cautiously, his boots rolling from heel to toe to minimize the crunch of the gravel. "Movement, 2 o'clock, 50 meters out, near that rocky outcropping," Hayes murmured. "Low to the ground, moving deliberate." Marcus signaled the squad to hold their positions while he moved up to join Hayes. The scrubland was notorious for smugglers and dangerous trespassers, but it was equally famous for its apex predators, mountain lions, coyotes, and javelinas. Marcus crouched behind a thick patch of prickly pear cactus, raising his optic to scan the area. The light was still incredibly bright, but as the afternoon approached, the shadows had begun to lengthen, creating pockets of obscurity among the rocks. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the shimmering heat waves rising from the stone. Then he saw it. It was a masterclass in camouflage. If it hadn't moved, it would have been invisible. A large, fully grown bobcat stepped silently from the shadow of a massive boulder. It was a magnificent specimen, thick-muscled and powerfully built, its tufted ears swiveling like radar dishes, its short, bobbed tail twitching with intense focus. "Stand down, squad. It's just a bobcat," Marcus relayed softly, a small smile touching his lips. He always appreciated a glimpse of the wild locals. But as Marcus lowered his optic, the situation shifted. The bobcat didn't scurry away as it should have upon detecting a squad of humans. Instead, it turned its head and locked its intense golden eyes directly on Marcus's position. The air grew suddenly thick. Instinct told Marcus to stay perfectly still. Wild bobcats are naturally elusive. An adult standing its ground in broad daylight, looking directly at a human, was anomalous behavior. It triggered a primal alarm bell in Marcus's brain. Was it rabid? Was it protecting a den? The bobcat took a step forward, leaving the cover of the rocks. It moved with a slow, deliberate fluidity, low to the ground. It was circling slightly to the right, closing the distance from 50 meters to 40. Marcus kept his composure, though his heart began to pound a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He slowly rested his hand on the grip of his sidearm, not wanting to use it, praying he wouldn't have to, but acutely aware of the unpredictability of a cornered predator. 30 meters. The bobcat stopped. Its posture was not aggressive. Its ears weren't pinned flat. Its back wasn't arched in a defensive bow. Instead, its posture felt different. It was alert, incredibly focused, but the energy radiating from the animal was not one of fear or attack. It was an intensity that felt, inexplicably, almost familiar. Then, the touching plot twist of the wild unfolded, not through human sentimentality, but through the raw, unfiltered reality of nature. Marcus was entirely focused on the cat, locked in a cross-species staring contest. He was so captivated by the animal's bold approach that he failed to notice what the bobcat had seen long before him. The bobcat suddenly broke its stare with Marcus. Its golden eyes darted down to the ground, just a few feet to Marcus's left, near a sun-baked slab of limestone he was about to step toward to get a better view. The feline let out a sharp, percussive hiss, a sound that sent a jolt of electricity straight down Marcus's spine. Instinctively, Marcus looked down and to his left. Coiled perfectly against the limestone, perfectly camouflaged in the dappled light and shadow, was a massive western diamondback rattlesnake. It was thick as a man's forearm, its diamond patterns blending seamlessly with the gravel. It had been entirely silent, feeling the vibrations of the soldiers, coiling tight, preparing to strike defensively as Marcus had inadvertently moved into its strike zone. Before Marcus could even flinch backwards, the bobcat moved. It didn't attack the snake. Bobcats are smart enough to avoid full-grown diamondbacks if they can help it. But it lunged forward into the brush, thrashing its heavy paws against the dry branches, creating a sudden, explosive cacophony of noise and dust. The sudden chaos startled the rattlesnake. Its self-preservation instinct overriding its defensive posture against the human, the snake rapidly uncoiled, its rattle finally emitting that terrifying, dry, buzzing sound as it slithered frantically away into a deep crevice beneath the rocks, seeking safety from the larger predator. Marcus stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, his adrenaline spiking so hard his hands shook. He had been mere inches from a potentially lethal bite in the middle of nowhere. The dust from the bobcat's thrashing settled. The terrifying buzz of the rattlesnake faded into the depths of the earth. The silence of the desert returned, heavier now, thick with the realization of what had just occurred. Marcus slowly looked up from the rocks, his chest heaving. The bobcat had not fled after startling the snake. It had retreated a few paces, but now it stood in the open, watching him. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the harsh, unforgiving light of the morning slowly began to transition. The sharp glare softened, bleeding into the early stages of the golden hour. The sky shifted from stark blue to a warmer hue, casting a rich, amber glow over the scrubland. In this new, warm light, the bobcat took another step closer. 20 meters. 15 meters. Marcus was frozen, not out of fear, but out of absolute awe. This was entirely against the rules of nature. The animal should have bolted. Instead, it was bridging the gap. As the cat turned slightly to navigate a patch of cactus, the warm, honeyed sunlight caught its left shoulder. Marcus stopped breathing entirely. There, etched across the powerful, muscular shoulder blade, stark white against the beautiful spotted coat, was a jagged, unmistakable scar. It ran from the top of the shoulder down toward the elbow. It was the exact shape, the exact length, the exact legacy of the terrible wound he had spent weeks cleaning, treating, and agonizing over. The realization hit him all at once, a wave of emotion so profound it nearly knocked him to his knees. This wasn't just any wild bobcat. This was his ghost. This was the broken, dying kitten he had fought so desperately to save a year ago, hundreds of miles away in the hill country. It had migrated, it had survived, it had thrived, and it had grown into this magnificent sovereign of the desert. Marcus didn't call out. He didn't reach his hand forward. He didn't make clicking noises or speak soft words. He was a rehabilitator. He knew the rules. He knew that to treat this animal like a pet now would be to insult the magnificent wildness it had fought so hard to reclaim. But something in Marcus's rigid military posture softened. The tension bled out of his shoulders. His hand moved away from his sidearm and rested gently at his side. He simply stood there, an open, vulnerable human in the presence of an apex predator, letting his eyes communicate the profound awe and relief flooding his soul. The bobcat seemed to sense the shift. The wild, tense distance between them seemed to evaporate in the warm, golden air. The animal approached. 10 meters. 5 meters. Marcus's squad, watching from behind, were statues, utterly silent, recognizing that something sacred was happening, even if they didn't understand it. The bobcat closed the final distance. It didn't look up at Marcus's face. It didn't seek affection, but it stepped deliberately into his personal space. Then, in a quiet, impossible gesture that defied every textbook on wildlife behavior, a gesture that felt like an undeniable, ancient recognition, the massive wildcat walked past him. As it did, its thick, muscular flank brushed against the heavy fabric of Marcus's tactical trousers. It was light, fleeting, and entirely deliberate. A single touch. A crossing of boundaries. The contact sent a shock wave of warmth through Marcus's entire body. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, committing the feeling, the weight, the reality of it to memory. The bobcat didn't linger. There was no dependence in the action, no hesitation, no request for food or comfort. It was simply a choice made by a free creature. It stepped back, the brief contact broken as quickly as it was made. The bobcat walked a few yards away, pausing at the edge of a thick stand of mesquite. The lighting had now fully surrendered to the sunset, painting the world in deep, rich tones of gold, amber, and softening violet. The harshness of the desert was gone, replaced by a warm, forgiving beauty. The animal turned back one final time. It stood tall, its profile noble and fierce against the setting sun. It looked at Marcus with a gaze that was calm, steady, and undeniably aware. There was no fear in those golden eyes, only a profound, silent understanding. The soldier understood then. The bond they had shared during those agonizing weeks of recovery, hadn't vanished when the crate door opened. It had simply changed. It had evolved from a bond of desperate reliance to a bond of mutual respect between two warriors who had survived the worst the world had to throw at them. The Bobcat no longer needed him. It was strong, capable, and perfectly adapted to its harsh, beautiful world. It had even, in its own instinctual way, returned a favor, altering the path of the rattlesnake. And that independence, that sheer, untamed capability, was the entire point. After that final, lingering look, the Bobcat turned. With a silent, fluid grace, it slipped into the shadows of the mesquite and disappeared into the wild it now fully and rightfully belonged to. "Sergeant?" Corporal Hayes's voice came over the comms, soft, hesitant, breaking the spell. "You good?" Marcus remained there for a long moment, the warm evening breeze washing over his face. His eyes were stinging, a hot tear tracking through the dust on his cheek, but a massive, irrepressible smile broke across his face. He felt humbled, honored, and deeply, profoundly at peace. He touched the fabric of his trousers where the animal had brushed against him. "I'm good, Hayes," Marcus whispered back, his voice thick with emotion but steady with a new, quiet strength. "I'm very good." He signaled the squad to resume the patrol, stepping carefully past the limestone rock where the snake had been. As he walked into the deepening, warm twilight, Marcus carried a new truth in his heart. He knew now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the greatest success in caring for a wild creature is not that it stays with you. It is not that it becomes tame or dependent. The ultimate triumph of love and conservation is that the creature can leave, that it can reclaim its wild soul, face the unforgiving world on its own terms, and still, somehow, against all the laws of nature, remember the hands that healed it. The desert night began to fall, wrapping the landscape in a warm, protective embrace. And for the first time in a long time, the soldier walked forward without the weight of the past holding him down, guided only by the comforting knowledge that out there in the vast American wilderness, his ghost was alive, free, and thriving.